Legacy of the land. James Larson woke before the sun, as he always did. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-soaked earth and the promise of spring. He stepped onto the warped wooden porch of his farmhouse, a mug of black coffee steaming in his calloused hands, and surveyed the land that had been his family's for 4 generations. The Larson farm stretched out before him, a patchwork of golden wheat fields rippling in the early breeze, dotted with grazing cattle and framed by a weathered red barn that stood as a testament to time. In the distance, the rooster crowed, sharp and reliable, piercing the stillness of the pre-dawn hour. It was a sound Jim cherished, a signal that the world was waking up just as it should. This was his sanctuary, a 200-acre slice of heaven on the outskirts of Willow Creek, a sleepy little town in the heart of rural America. The farm wasn't just his livelihood. It was his legacy, handed down from his great-grandfather, a man who'd carved it out of the wilderness with nothing but grit and a mule. Jim's father had added the barn, his grandfather the cattle pens, and Jim himself had modernized the irrigation system, small improvements that kept the place alive without changing its soul. He liked it simple, uncluttered by the chaos of the modern world. Out here, life made sense. 5 years ago, though, the horizon had shifted. Where there'd once been dense woodlands bordering his property, a tangle of oaks and pines that muffled the world beyond, a new development had sprouted up like weeds after a rain. Pineview Estates, they called it, a sprawling grid of cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns and asphalt streets that gleamed under the sun. It had swallowed the forest whole, replacing the wild with something sterile and orderly. Jim didn't mind at first. The newcomers kept to themselves, and the country road that separated his farm from their neighborhood acted like an invisible line neither side crossed. Occasionally, he'd spot a jogger in neon sneakers or a kid on a bike pedaling along the gravel, but they never bothered him. City folks looking for a quieter life, he figured. Let them have it. For a while, it worked. The farm and Pineview coexisted in an uneasy truce, 2 worlds brushing shoulders, but never quite touching. Jim sold eggs and vegetables from a rickety stand at the end of his driveway, and sometimes a Pineview resident would stop by, offering a polite nod and a few bucks for a dozen brown eggs. They'd complain in hushed tones about the HOA fees or the rules about trash can placement, and Jim would just chuckle, glad his land was beyond their reach. He had no use for their petty squabbles. His farm was his own, free and clear, and that was how he intended to keep it. That is, until Eleanor Grayson arrived. Ellie, as she insisted everyone call her, wasn't just another Pineview resident. She was a force of nature wrapped in a pressed blouse and beige slacks, a woman who walked with the certainty of someone who'd never heard the word no. She'd moved into Pineview a year ago, and within months, she'd seized control of the homeowners association with the efficiency of a general staging a coup. Under her reign, Pineview became her personal fiefdom. Mailboxes had to be a precise shade of taupe, no deviations allowed. Fences couldn't exceed 4 feet, measured to the inch. Trash cans left curbside a minute past pickup time earned a scathing note taped to your door, written in her sharp, impeccable cursive. She ruled with an iron fist and a clipboard, and the residents bent to her will, too afraid of her fines and reprimands to push back. Jim heard the stories from his customers. She fined me $50 because my dog barked at a squirrel, one man grumbled, handing over a crumpled tin for a sack of potatoes. Told me my garage door was too vibrant. It's gray, for God's sake. Another woman muttered, shaking her head as she picked out a dozen eggs. Jim would just smile and shrug. Sounds like a headache, he'd say, keeping his tone light. Good thing I'm out here. And he was. His farm sat just outside Pineview's jurisdiction, a fact he thanked his lucky stars for every day. Their rules didn't apply to him, and as far as he was concerned, they never would. But Ellie had other ideas. It was a Tuesday morning in early March when she first showed up. Jim was out by the fence, wrestling with a loose post that had started to lean after a storm. The sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, when he heard the unmistakable crunch of heels on gravel. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow, and turned to see her marching down his driveway like she owned the place. She was a vision of suburban authority, white blouse starched to perfection, slacks creased sharp enough to cut glass, and a pair of designer sunglasses perched on her nose. A clipboard was tucked under her arm, her fingers drumming against it like a war drum. "Mr. Larson, I presume," she called out, her voice clipped but coated in a thin layer of politeness. She stopped a few feet away, sizing him up with a look that suggested she'd already found him wanting. Jim wiped his hands on his jeans and gave her a slow nod. "That's me. And you are?" "Eleanor Grayson," she said, as if the name carried weight he should recognize. "President of the Pineview Estates Homeowners Association." She paused, waiting for a reaction. When Jim just stared at her, one eyebrow raised, she cleared her throat and pressed on. "I'd like to have a word with you about your property." "My property," Jim echoed, crossing his arms. He didn't like where this was going. "Yes." She waved a hand toward his farm, her nose wrinkling slightly as if the sight of it offended her. "You may not be aware, but your land is highly visible from the backyards of several Pineview residents. We take pride in maintaining a certain standard in our community, and, well, your farm doesn't quite align with that." Jim blinked, then let out a low chuckle. "Lady, this farm's been here a hell of a lot longer than your houses. I don't think it's my job to match your standards." Ellie's smile tightened, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, but we've received complaints, several, in fact, about a few specific issues. For instance, the color of your barn." She gestured toward the red structure in the distance. "It's rather bold. A more neutral tone might blend better with the neighborhood." "Bold," Jim repeated, incredulous. "That barn's been red since my great-grandpa built it in 23. I'm not repainting it because some folks don't like the view." Her smile flickered but held. "There's also the matter of your animals. The rooster, specifically. Residents have mentioned being woken up at unreasonable hours." Jim shook his head, half amused, half annoyed. "That's what roosters do. If they wanted silence, they shouldn't have moved next to a farm." Ellie pursed her lips, her patience visibly thinning. "I understand change can be difficult, Mr. Larson, but this is in everyone's best interest. We'd hate for this to become complicated." That word, complicated, hung in the air like a veiled threat. Jim's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Miss Grayson, let me make this clear. This farm ain't part of your HOA. I don't follow your rules, and I don't take orders about how to run my land. You can take your complaints back where they came from." For a moment, her mask slipped, and a flash of irritation crossed her face. But she recovered quickly, smoothing her expression into that thin-lipped smile. "I see," she said, her tone icy. "If that's your stance, we'll have to explore other options." Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode back to her car, heels clicking with every step. Jim watched her go, shaking his head. He'd dealt with stubborn mules and ornery goats in his time, but something told him Ellie Grayson was going to be a different kind of beast altogether. As her car disappeared down the road toward Pineview, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. And he was right. The morning after Eleanor Grayson's visit, James Larson tried to put the encounter out of his mind. He had fences to mend, cows to feed, and a tractor that needed a new spark plug. Real work, not the petty nonsense of some HOA dictator. But as he hammered a nail into a post, he couldn't shake the unease her words had left behind. "Complicated," she'd said, like a promise she intended to keep. Jim wasn't a man who scared easy, but he knew trouble when he smelled it, and Ellie reeked of it. Trouble didn't take long to show up. A week later, as Jim was unloading hay bales from his truck, the mail carrier pulled up in her beat-up Jeep. "Got a stack for you today, Jim," she called, handing over a bundle tied with a rubber band. Most of it was the usual, seed catalogs, a bill from the co-op, but one envelope stood out. Crisp, white, and stamped with the Pineview Estates HOA logo. Jim tore it open, expecting a follow-up to Ellie's ridiculous barn complaint. What he got was worse. "Dear Mr. Larson," it began in stiff, formal type. "It has come to the attention of the Pineview Estates Homeowners Association that your property violates several community standards visible to our residents. These include, but are not limited to, the garish color of your barn, excessive noise from livestock, and the unsightly condition of your land, all of which negatively impact the aesthetic harmony of our neighborhood." The letter went on for 2 pages, listing violations like his roosters crowing and the visual clutter of his wheat fields. It ended with a polite but pointed request to rectify these issues or face further action. Jim laughed out loud, crumpling the paper and tossing it into the cab of his truck. Aesthetic harmony, he muttered. They built their houses next to my farm, not the other way around. He figured that'd be the end of it. Ellie blowing hot air to feel important. But the letters kept coming. Every few days, another one arrived, each more absurd than the last. One claimed his tractor was an eyesore parked in plain sight. Another suggested his cattle pens were a health hazard because they smelled like, well, cattle. Jim stopped reading them after the third, letting the pile grow on his kitchen counter like a monument to Ellie's insanity. Then the inspectors showed up. It was a chilly Thursday morning when a county zoning officer rolled up in a dusty pickup, clipboard in hand. Jim met him at the gate, coffee still in his grip. "Morning," he said, eyeing the man warily. "What's this about?" "Name's Pete Rollins," the officer replied, offering a sheepish smile. "Got a complaint about zoning violations on your property. Mind if I take a look around?" Jim sighed, already knowing the source. "Let me guess, Pineview Estates." Pete hesitated, then nodded. "Off the record, yeah? They've been lighting up our phone lines about you. Noise, structures, you name it." "Go ahead and look," Jim said, stepping aside. "Won't find a damn thing out of order." Pete didn't. He walked the property line, checked the barn, peeked at the cattle pens. Everything was textbook legal. The Larson farm was zoned agricultural, had been since the county drew its maps, and Jim kept it in pristine shape. After an hour, Pete returned, shaking his head. "You're clean as a whistle," he said. "Sorry to waste your time." "Don't apologize," Jim replied. "You're just doing your job. It's that HOA wasting everybody's." Pete chuckled. "You're not wrong. Half my week's tied up with their complaints. Your farm, some guy's shed, a lady's pink flamingo lawn ornaments. They're a real pain in the ass." "Tell me about it," Jim said, waving as Pete drove off. He thought that'd be the end of it, but the next week, another inspector arrived, this time from the health department, citing anonymous concerns about his livestock. She found nothing either, just like Pete. By the third visit, a fire marshal checking his barn for code violations, Jim realized Ellie wasn't just complaining. She was waging war. The harassment didn't stop at inspectors. One morning, Jim caught sight of a black SUV idling on the road near his fence. It wasn't in his driveway, just sitting there, windows tinted dark. He squinted, trying to make out the driver, but when he took a step toward it, the vehicle peeled away, disappearing toward Pineview. The next day, he found a group of HOA types, Ellie among them, standing at the edge of his land, snapping photos and whispering like spies. When he approached, Ellie turned, her smile smug as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Larson," she said, clipboard clutched tight. "We're conducting a review. The community's concerned about your farm's impact on property values." Jim crossed his arms, patience wearing thin. "I don't give a damn about your property values." Her smile didn't budge. Perhaps not. But the county might. That was it. Proof she wasn't going to stop. She couldn't touch him legally, not yet, but she'd keep poking, prodding, trying to wear him down. Jim stared her down as she and her posse retreated, already plotting his next move. Ellie Grayson wanted a fight? She'd get one. Ames Larson had always prided himself on his patience. For generations of farming had taught him that some things, weather, crops, stubborn livestock, couldn't be rushed or forced. But Eleanor Grayson was testing that patience like nothing else ever had. The letters from Pineview Estates kept piling up on his kitchen counter, each one more ridiculous than the last, and the county inspectors had become an almost weekly nuisance. Jim could handle that, though. He'd laugh off the complaints, wave off the officials, and get back to work. What he couldn't handle was the feeling that Ellie was watching him. It started subtly. A week after her photo-snapping posse had scurried off his land, Jim noticed a black SUV parked on the country road again. Same tinted windows, same eerie stillness. He was hauling water to the cattle troughs when he spotted it, just sitting there, engine idling. He set the bucket down and stared, waiting to see if it'd move. When it didn't, he took a few steps toward it, boots crunching on gravel. The SUV's engine revved, and it sped off toward Pineview, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Jim frowned, brushing it off as some nosy HOA busybody, but the unease lingered. Then the notes started showing up. The first one came tucked into his mailbox a few days later. No envelope, just a folded scrap of paper. "Your farm is a disgrace to this neighborhood." It read in tight, aggressive cursive. "Do the right thing and move somewhere more appropriate." No signature, but Jim didn't need one. He could practically hear Ellie's clipped voice in every word. He crumpled it and tossed it onto the letter pile, muttering, "If you don't like it, don't look at it." But they kept coming. Every couple of days, another note. "The noise is unbearable. Leave. This eyesore lowers our property values. We won't stop until you comply." They weren't signed, of course, but the tone, sharp, passive-aggressive, dripping with entitlement, was Ellie's signature as surely as if she'd stamped her name on them. Jim started saving them, not because he cared what they said, but because he figured they might come in handy if this got uglier. And it did. One crisp morning in mid-March, as Jim was mucking out the barn, he heard a faint buzzing overhead. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes against the sun, and spotted it. A drone, hovering low over his wheat field like a mechanical vulture. Its camera glinted as it swung toward the barn, then the cattle pens. Jim's jaw tightened. He'd seen kids fly toy drones in town, but this was no kid's plaything. It was sleek, expensive, and deliberate. And he had a damn good guess who'd sent it. He stormed into the house, grabbed his old hunting rifle from the closet, and marched back out. The drone was still there, buzzing obnoxiously as it circled his property. Jim raised the rifle, aimed high above it, and fired a single warning shot into the air. The crack echoed across the fields, and the drone wobbled, then zipped away, disappearing over Pineview's rooftops. Jim lowered the gun, breathing hard. "Try that again," he muttered, "and I won't miss." That evening, another county official showed up, this time a woman from the zoning office, clutching a clipboard and a stack of photos. "Got a report of possible violations," she said, eyeing the farm warily. "Animal enclosures not up to code." Jim crossed his arms. "Let me guess, Pineview?" She smirked, barely hiding her amusement. "You're catching on quick." He led her to the pens, already knowing what she'd find. Nothing. The enclosures were solid, the animals healthy, everything legal. She flipped through her photos, grainy shots of his barn and cattle, clearly taken from above. "Drone pics," she said, shaking her head. "Someone's got too much time on their hands." "Someone's got too much nerve," Jim corrected. When she left, confirming no violations, she paused at her truck. "You must have really pissed someone off." "Oh, you have no idea," he replied, watching her drive away. The next day, he caught a man lurking near his fence, mid-30s, wiry, with a camera slung around his neck. The guy was snapping pictures of the barn like a paparazzo staking out a celebrity. Jim dropped his pitchfork and strode over, boots pounding the dirt. "Hey, what the hell you doing?" The man froze, eyes wide, then bolted, sprinting toward a car parked on the road. Jim didn't chase him. He didn't need to. The car peeled out toward Pineview, and that was proof enough. Ellie wasn't just complaining anymore. She'd hired a damn private investigator to dig up dirt. That night, another HOA letter arrived, this time citing zoning discrepancies with attached photos straight from that camera. Jim sat at his kitchen table, staring at the growing stack of paper, letters, notes, photos. His patience was fraying, his temper simmering. Ellie wanted to make his life hell, wear him down with 1,000 little cuts. Maybe she thought he'd cave, sell out, disappear. She didn't know him at all. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a Larson, and Larsons didn't back down. This wasn't annoyance anymore. It was war. And Jim was ready to fight back. James Larson had dealt with plenty of threats in his life. Storms that tore through his crops, coyotes eyeing his cattle, a bank loan that nearly sank the farm in '98. But none of them had the audacity of Eleanor Grayson. The letters, the inspectors, the drone, the PI. It was all noise, irritating but manageable. Then she crossed a line he couldn't ignore. It was a Thursday afternoon, the sky a flat, gray promising rain. Jim was out by the property line, fixing a stretch of fence the wind had battered loose. He'd just driven a new post into the ground when he heard it. The whine of power tools, faint but unmistakable. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and peered toward the road. His stomach dropped. A crew of workers, 3 guys in hard hats, were sinking fence posts into his land, a good 10 feet past the public road. And standing off to the side, overseeing it all like a queen on a throne, was Ellie Grayson, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose, smug as ever. Jim's fists clenched. He dropped his hammer and strode toward them, boots kicking up dirt. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, voice carrying over the hum of a drill. Ellie turned, her expression calm and calculated. "Good afternoon, Mr. Larson," she said, as if they were chatting over tea. "No need to raise your voice." "I'll raise whatever I damn well please," Jim snapped, gesturing at the workers. "I'll ask again, what the hell is this?" She sighed, a dramatic little huff. "This is a necessary improvement. Pineview Estates is installing a fence to maintain our residents' privacy and preserve the aesthetic value of our community. Your farm, frankly, is an eyesore." Jim laughed, sharp and humorless. "An eyesore? Lady, you're putting a fence on my land." Ellie's smile didn't falter. "The HOA has reviewed historical property maps and determined there may have been an error in the original lines. We believe this strip." "You believe?" Jim cut her off, stepping closer. "You don't get to believe anything about my property. I've got deeds going back 100 years, and this land's mine, clear as day." She didn't blink. "Until the matter's formally reviewed, we're proceeding with the installation." Jim turned to the workers, who'd paused, drills silent. "You boys got a permit for this?" One of them, a stocky guy with a beard, shifted uncomfortably. The HOA said they had all the legal permissions." "They don't," Jim said flatly. "And if you don't pack up and leave in the next 5 minutes, you're trespassing. That means I call the sheriff." The workers exchanged glances, unease rippling through them. The bearded one shut off his drill, muttering, "I ain't going to jail for this." They started gathering tools, clearly not paid enough to risk it. Ellie's smug mask cracked. "You can't just order them to leave," she snapped. Jim pulled out his phone. "Then let's make it official. Sheriff's a friend of mine. He'll sort this out." Her lips pressed into a thin line, fury flashing in her eyes. She stood there, rigid, as if willing him to back down. When he didn't, she gave a tight nod to the crew. "Pack it up," she barked. They loaded their gear into a truck and drove off, leaving the half-sunk posts like abandoned battlements. Ellie lingered, glaring at Jim. "This isn't over," she said, voice low. "Damn right it's not," he replied, meeting her gaze. She turned on her heel and marched back to her SUV, tires squealing as she sped away. Jim stood there, adrenaline pumping. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a direct attack on his land, his rights. He'd stopped her this time, but Ellie wasn't done. She'd come back harder, and he'd be ready. He grabbed his hammer and went back to his fence, mind racing with plans. If she wanted war, she'd get it. Part 5, The Fraudulent Sign. Word count, 2, 500 words. The fence incident left James Larson on edge, waiting for Eleanor Grayson's next move. He didn't have to wait long. The very next morning, as he stepped out to feed the chickens, he froze. Staked near the end of his driveway was a massive for sale sign, bold black letters screaming against a white background. Below it, a smaller placard read, "Under negotiation, coming soon, Pineview Estates expansion." Jim's blood ran cold, then hot. This wasn't just a jab, it was fraud, plain and simple. He marched over, fists clenched, and read it again, hoping he'd imagined it. Nope. The sign stood tall, a deliberate lie planted on his land. He didn't call Ellie, he didn't need to. This had her fingerprints all over it. With a grunt, he yanked the sign from the ground, metal screeching as it came free, and hauled it to his porch, tossing it onto the pile of HOA letters. He was halfway through his coffee when her white SUV pulled up, right on cue. Ellie stepped out, all for sweetness. "Good morning, Mr. Larson," she said, eyeing the sign. "I see you've noticed our little mix-up." "Mix-up?" Jim set his mug down, voice hard. "You put a for sale sign on my property. That's not a mix-up, that's a lie." She adjusted her sunglasses, unruffled. "An unfortunate error. The HOA's been discussing expansion plans, and some of our real estate partners assumed your farm was part of the deal." "Assumed," Jim repeated, stepping off the porch. "You don't assume someone's land is yours." She nodded, as if this were perfectly reasonable. "A misunderstanding, really. But it does open an opportunity. There's high demand for new homes here. We'd be willing to make you a generous offer to sell." Jim laughed, a short, bitter sound. You think I'd sell my farm to you? This land's been in my family since 1923. It's not for sale, and sure as hell not to you. Her smile soured. I'd reconsider, Mr. Larson. Willow Creek's growing. You could avoid a messy legal fight and walk away with a fat check. My answer's no, he said, taking a step closer. And if you or your HOA pull this stunt again, I'll be talking to a lawyer. Ellie's eyes narrowed, her composure slipping. She stared at him, searching for a crack, but Jim didn't budge. Finally, she turned, stalking back to her car without another word. As she drove off, Jim knew she wouldn't stop. This was her boldest move yet, and he'd shut it down, but it lit a fire in him. No more playing defense. It was time to hit back. He called Clara Evans that afternoon, a lawyer he'd known since high school. Got an HOA trying to steal my land, he told her. Fake signs, fake complaints, the works. Clara's voice crackled with amusement. Sounds like fun. Bring me everything you've got, letters, photos, that sign. We'll make him regret it. Jim grinned. The war was on, and he was ready to win. James Larson wasn't a vengeful man by nature, but Eleanor Grayson had pushed him too far. The fake for sale sign was the last straw, proof she'd stop at nothing to claim his farm. Jim wasn't about to let her win, but he wasn't going to stoop to her level either. He'd fight back his way, legal, loud, and just petty enough to drive her nuts. First came the roosters. Ellie had whined about his one bird waking her precious residents. Fine. Jim drove to a poultry auction the next day and came home with 4 more, each louder than the last. By 4:45 a.m., his rooster choir was in full swing, a cacophony of crows echoing straight into Pineview. He stood on his porch, coffee in hand, grinning as the sound rolled over the rooftops. Let's see how you like that, he muttered. Next, the view. Ellie hated his farm's unsightly look. Jim called up some farmer buddies and spent a weekend planting sunflowers along the property line, rows of them, thick and tall, stretching a quarter-mile. By late March, they'd shot up to 10 feet, a solid yellow wall blocking Pineview's perfect suburban vista. He'd sell the seeds at his farm stand, making it a legit crop, untouchable by HOA rules. When Ellie stormed over, fuming, he handed her a zoning printout. Agriculture, ma'am, he said. All legal. She sputtered. This is an outrage. Funny, Jim replied. I think it's pretty. The grand finale was the farmer's market. Jim had toyed with the idea for years, but Ellie's word gave him the push. He put up signs around town, Larson Farms Market, fresh produce, family fun, every Saturday, and opened the first event a week later. Dozens showed up, families buying eggs, kids petting goats, a fiddler strumming tunes. Midway through, Ellie arrived, arms crossed, voice shrill. This is unacceptable. You can't turn your land into a circus. Jim grinned. County says I can. AG events on private farmland. Look it up. She stormed off, powerless, and Jim knew he'd struck gold. The market wasn't just revenge, it was a declaration. He wasn't going anywhere. The farmer's market was James Larson's masterstroke. What started as a petty jab at Eleanor Grayson bloomed into something bigger, a full-blown rebellion against her control. The first Saturday drew 100 folks, the next 300. By the third week, Jim expanded it. More farmers with stalls, food trucks slinging burgers, a petting zoo with his goats and a pony. A local brewery joined, turning it into a weekend beer garden, and a bluegrass band played so loud the music drifted into Pineview. Ellie tried to stop it. She showed up mid-event, screaming, "This violates community standards." Jim just shrugged. Not my community. Checked with the county, 100% legal. She threatened a lawsuit, but Jim had already called Clara Evans, who drafted a cease and desist order warning Ellie off further harassment. It arrived in her mailbox Monday, and for once, she went quiet. The market didn't just annoy Ellie, it fractured her grip. Pineview residents started sneaking over, buying produce, sipping beers, enjoying themselves. Hank Thompson, a grizzled mechanic, became a regular, grumbling. Better than anything the HOA's ever done. Even some of Ellie's loyalists wavered, lured by the fun. Jim saw it in their eyes. Her perfect little kingdom was cracking. He leaned into it, adding flyers, inviting more vendors, making it a town staple. Nearly 1,000 showed up one weekend, kids laughing, music blaring. Ellie's threats echoed hollow. She couldn't touch him. Jim sat on his porch that night, market lights still twinkling, and smiled. He wasn't just winning, he was rewriting the rules. Eleanor Grayson's reign was unraveling, and James Larson didn't even have to lift a finger to finish it. The blow came from within Pineview, delivered by Sarah Mitchell, a soft-spoken woman who'd once sat on the HOA board. She showed up at Jim's farm stand one afternoon, a thick folder in hand. "You don't know me," she said, "but I've got something you'll want to see." Jim raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Proof," Sarah replied, handing it over. "Ellie's been lying. About you, about everything." The folder was a goldmine. Internal HOA emails showing Ellie had faked resident complaints, using made-up names to pad reports against Jim's farm. Another document outlined a special assessment fee she'd tried to push, a tax on residents to fund a legal war against him. "She got me kicked off the board when I questioned her," Sarah said. "Now folks are fed up, especially with your market." Jim grinned. "Guess she picked the wrong fight." Sarah took her evidence to an emergency HOA meeting Ellie had called, expecting to rally support against Jim. Instead, it became her undoing. She stood at the community center, railing about disruptions, when Sarah stood up, papers in hand. "You mean these fake complaints?" she asked, tossing them onto the table. Gasps rippled through the room as she revealed the fee plan. Hank Thompson growled, "You've been wasting our money on this?" Ellie stammered, caught flat-footed. The board president, Richard Hayes, called a vote of no confidence. It passed in minutes. Ellie was out, her power stripped. She left the room in stunned silence, the dictator toppled by her own people. Jim didn't need to be there to know he'd won. Eleanor Grayson's fall was swift and brutal. By morning, word of her ousting spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. She tried to save face, claiming she'd stepped down voluntarily, but no one bought it. The truth was too juicy. Fake complaints, secret fees, a farmer's market that broke her. A week later, a for sale sign went up in her yard. Ellie was fleeing Pineview, tail between her legs. Jim heard it from Sarah, who stopped by with a grin. "She's gone," she said. "Listed her house yesterday." Jim just nodded, satisfied. The new HOA, led by Sarah and Hank, came to him with an apology, pies and preserves in hand. "Things will be different now," Hank said. "No more crazy rules." They were right. Pineview relaxed. No more fines, no more nonsense. Jim's market thrived, a town treasure, and his farm stood untouched, a testament to his stand. Ellie's war had backfired, and as she packed her SUV and drove away, Jim knew she'd never dare return. He'd beaten her at her own game, and the land was still his. The sun was just dipping below the horizon when James Larson settled onto his porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. It was late March 2025, and the air carried the faint promise of spring, new growth, new beginnings. The Larson farm stretched out before him, alive with the hum of evening, crickets chirping, cattle lowing softly, and the distant echo of laughter from the last stragglers leaving his farmer's market. The day had been a good one, maybe the best in months. The market had drawn nearly 1,000 folks, families from Willow Creek and beyond, buying eggs, petting goats, and tapping their feet to a bluegrass band that had played until dusk. Even a few Pineview residents had shown up, no longer afraid of crossing some invisible line. Ellie Grayson was gone. The news had trickled in a week ago, confirmed by Sarah Mitchell when she'd stopped by with a fresh apple pie. "She listed her house," Sarah had said, grinning. "Packed up and left yesterday. Good riddance." Jim had just nodded, taking a bite of pie and savoring the sweetness of victory. After months of her schemes, letters, inspectors, that damn fence stunt, the fake for sale sign, he'd outlasted her. Not just outlasted, outfought. She'd come at him with everything she had, and he'd turned it all back on her. Pineview had changed overnight. Without Ellie's iron grip, the HOA shed its suffocating rules. No more fines for trash cans or mailbox shades. The new leadership, folks like Hank Thompson and Sarah, focused on practical stuff. Fixing potholes, sprucing up the park. They'd even come to Jim with an apology, a basket of homemade goods in tow. "We figured we owed you," Sarah had said, handing over a pecan pie. Hank scratched his head and added, "Most of us never minded your farm. Just didn't want Ellie on our backs." Jim had smirked, accepting the peace offering. Long as you don't try annexing my land, we're square. The war was over, and Jim had won. His farm wasn't just intact, it was thriving. The farmers' market had grown into a town institution, a weekly celebration of rural life that drew crowds from miles around. Tourists snapped photos with his sunflowers, now a towering wall of yellow along the property line, and locals raved about his eggs and cider. Even the roosters, 5 of them now, crowing in unison at 4:45 a.m., had become a quirky badge of honor, a middle finger to the HOA's old regime. But the real kicker came a few days ago. Hank had dropped by with a newspaper, a grin splitting his weathered face. "Thought you'd get a kick out of this," he'd said, tossing it onto the porch table. Jim unfolded it, eyes landing on the headline. Ex-HOA president faces backlash in new neighborhood, caught in her own rules. Below it was a grainy photo of Ellie, scowling outside a house with a for sale sign staked in the yard. The article detailed her latest flop. She'd moved to another HOA community, tried her old power grab, and run smack into a president tougher than she'd ever been. Fined for her grass being too tall, her car parked wrong, her welcome mat unapproved. Ellie was drowning in the same petty tyranny she'd once dished out. She'd lasted 3 months before putting her house back on the market. Jim had laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "Karma's a hell of a thing," he'd said, setting the paper aside. It was the perfect coda to their saga. Ellie, the queen of control, brought low by her own game. Now, as the sky darkened and the first stars winked into view, Jim leaned back in his chair, boots propped on the railing. He'd put up a new sign that morning, right where the road met his driveway. "Welcome to Larson Farms. No HOA, no Karens, no problems." It was cedar, hand-carved, standing 8 feet tall for all to see. Already, folks were calling it a landmark. Kids posed with it, tourists Instagrammed it, and the town had adopted it as a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that some things couldn't be tamed, no matter how hard you tried. Jim sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. He thought about his great-grandfather, breaking this land with nothing but a plow and a dream. He thought about his father, raising that red barn with sweat and pride. And he thought about himself, standing firm against Ellie's onslaught, turning her war into his triumph. The Larson farm wasn't just land. It was a legacy, one he'd fought for and won. In the distance, a rooster crowed, late and off schedule, and Jim chuckled. Ellie might have hated it, but to him, it was the sound of freedom. She was gone, her empire crumbled, and somewhere out there, she was learning what it felt like to lose. Jim raised his mug to the night sky, a silent toast to the land, the fight, and the victory that was his. The farmer had won.